And this work is absolutely essential, so I would like to thank him for hosting the event. We met a year ago in Glasgow, and together we raised our ambitions for climate. We also took stock of progress achieved and also made a number of decisions. All that was said last year remains valid because indeed, even if our world has changed, climate cannot be the adjustment variable for the war waged by Russia on Ukrainian soil. Indeed, the Russian aggression against Ukraine has brought back war to Europe, but also plunged the world into deep uncertainty, energy tensions, food scarcity, and has compounded challenges for a number of countries in Africa and the Mediterranean basin. And this crisis came a few months after the pandemic and supplemented existing crises. And so there could be a tendency to say climate can wait. But at the same time, we see a number of states that are struck by the consequences of climate change. And they have shown us once again that the climate emergency is here. At the end of the day, we have one duty, and that is the duty to continue to take action on mitigation, on adaptation, on crisis preparedness, and reparation for crises and climate change in this period of profound shocks and of the return of war in Europe. And after the heads of state and government who've spoken before me, I also wanted to add a few words. First of all, we will not sacrifice our climate targets in the face of war waged by Russia, and so we should continue pursuing those targets. The rich countries such as France and other European countries have deposited their national strategies. Other countries need to follow suit. We established the Fit for 55 plan to reduce our carbon emissions by 55% by 2030, and that will rest on energy frugality on one side, on accelerating renewables and solutions that allow us to move away from fossil fuels for the long run, as well as rely on nuclear energy. It is a full-fledged strategy, and it requires a number of changes. The second key aspect is that we need to continue fighting on mitigation. We need to phase our economies away from coal. That is true for rich countries, but we also need to help emerging countries achieve that transition as soon as possible for a holistic strategy and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So we need to stay the course, and that is why I believe very much in what we started in Glasgow, that is the JET-P partnerships, which has been the key as part of the mitigation strategy. A first step was taken with South Africa. France will invest €1 billion into this project in order to help South Africa move away from coal. And this strategy is focused on renewables, nuclear energy, and on energy saving. We want to forge ahead on this, work with Indonesia, India, Senegal, but it is very clear we need to go further still. The energy revolution is possible, and it needs this type of strategy with emerging countries. We also want to move ahead on other initiatives. India has made a strong statement, so has Kenya, so have other African countries with accelerated strategies for renewables, which we will continue to support because renewable energy is less and less costly, is increasingly safe, and of course has lower carbon content content and in today's context, they're extremely relevant. The third message I wanted to convey is that we should not forget that this fight for climate, this fight against climate change, is intricately linked with the fight for biodiversity. They are twin struggles. And I wanted to say that before we meet in Montreal and following the One Planet summits that we held in recent years. We know that nature is our number one ally to achieve the aims of the Paris Agreement. Biodiversity and the fight against climate change go hand in hand. And very often, the poorest countries hold the solutions to the fight against climate change. They have biodiversity reserves, both on land and in the sea. And these are very valuable carbon sinks. We need to help these countries preserve them and to use nature-based solutions. For instance, critical ecosystems, forests, mangroves, wetlands, which are carbon sinks and also have great biodiversity. If these ecosystems are destroyed, we will be releasing a massive amount of carbon into the atmosphere. 100 countries have already committed to classifying 30% of their territories as protected areas. This is an initiative that we launched with Costa Rica, and I want the biodiversity COP in 3 weeks to help us go further still. We should recognize these ecosystems, give them a special status, and set up political and financial contracts to safeguard them. We need to be able to support states that choose to safeguard this biodiversity and these carbon sinks. And that is why this morning, with several states who are present here, Colombia, Gabon, Rwanda, representatives of indigenous peoples, the Philippines, China, the US, and Europe, we launched an initiative similar to JETP. We want to launch a positive preservation program by setting up country contracts with NGOs such as Conservation International and create a method to fund preservation for these spaces. We want to develop contracts that give us a range of political, financial tools in order to help us forge ahead. Gabon, Colombia, and the Philippines have already joined the initiative. We will be meeting in Libreville, Gabon in early 2023 during the One Forest Summit organized with President Bongo, who took the floor a few minutes ago. And we want to start the same type of initiative for the oceans in view of the 2025 UN conference on oceans. The oceans are the new frontier for cooperation and multilateralism. And once again, we need to spare no effort to preserve biodiversity in our oceans. And I want to be very clear, France will rise to the occasion. And as I already said, that is why France is supporting the ban on exploiting the deep sea bed. And that is something that I plan to stand by. This morning, we launched a high-level group to create a methodology for biodiversity credits. And by early 23, we plan to have a common method for this. And finally, I wanted to focus on climate justice. We have made commitments, and as of today, trust is eroding, trust between the global North and the global South. A few weeks ago at the UN General Assembly, I said it was important to avoid this great divide, and it is true in the face of war as well as in the context of climate change. Many countries have heard us talk about the figure of $100 billion since Copenhagen, and this has not materialized. We have mobilized $82 billion. We need to get to $100 billion in the next few months. And the remaining rich countries that have not made pledges need to step up. And we need to find different sources of funding, be they bilateral or multilateral, to ensure that this money gets to the global South. Otherwise, trust will completely collapse. And so, we are at 82 billion. We need to get to 100 billion soon and make sure that a change is felt on the ground. The other aspect is adaptation. France invests 6 billion euros a year for adaptation, in keeping with our Copenhagen and Paris agreements. So 6 billion in total and 2 billion that goes to adaptation. And once again, developed countries need to step up. And in the coming days, I plan to try and convince those who have not yet made these commitments. And I want to thank the heads of state and government who are here today and sometimes who may not be able to forge ahead as quickly as they would like. It is important to work in partnership with territories that are the most affected. And that is what we sought to launch with the Great Green Wall from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa, with excellent results, record engagement, financial commitments since the beginning of the year, 19 billion euros, and 2.5 billion euros spent on the ground with projects that help mitigate climate change, that support agricultural and agroforestry and fight against desertification. So you protect the climate, biodiversity, and bring economic opportunities to vulnerable countries by focusing on food sovereignty. And once again, we need to quicken the pace, build better partnerships with NGOs on the ground, with entrepreneurs, in order to step up to the challenge of climate justice. And as I was saying, we need to do even better, better than $100 billion, better than these initiatives. And I will conclude there. We need a big consensual financing shock. And that is at the heart of the debate that many have tabled, that is to say, that of loss and damage. And I want to acknowledge the courage of the African, Caribbean, Pacific, and Latin American leaders who said, well, we could very well talk of the past, but instead we want to talk about the future. And they're saying not only did we emit less in the past, not only did you prevent us from developing, but we will also be most affected by the consequences of climate change because we are vulnerable islands, because of our geographical realities. And they're right. That is a fair statement to make. But all of these countries, all of the middle-income countries, that is, some emerging countries, and the poorest countries all saw how rich countries behaved during the pandemic. We were all faced with a symmetrical shock, and we were able to mobilize exceptional levels of financing. And what these countries are saying today is we are facing exceptional circumstances, water shortages, deep disruptions to our lives. So how can you say that we should be coming back to business as usual? And they're right, it cannot be business as usual. And so it is time for a deep shock. We started it during the pandemic, but we were already too late, and we are still too late. We need to focus on special drawing rights. We need to focus on $100 billion for the poorest countries. We will, during the G20, try to push for a move from 20 to 30%. And with Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, whose courage I want to salute and acknowledge, we decided to set up a high-level group who will make recommendations on innovative financing for climate. And next spring, that is to say, not in 2 years, not in 3 years, we have asked the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD to come up with concrete solutions to activate these innovative financing mechanisms in order to get access to new types of funding capacity for countries, including middle-income countries, that have to deal with these challenges. We've asked them to recommend solutions that consider the climate vulnerability of these countries and to mobilize private exceptional funding as well as public funding, and change the rules of the game together, the rules of our international banks, of our development banks, of the IMF, of the World Bank, and our own rules. That is to say, what you're being asked for as terms of debt. When a country is subject to climate accidents, we should consider that in the terms of debt repayment. And that is at the heart of the loss and damage issue. And so with emerging countries, with developing countries, with middle-income countries, we will do that work. We will completely transform our ways of thinking before it is too late. And this is a partnership with Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and by next spring we want to set up this high-level group that will make these recommendations so that we may change our rules and our functioning by the spring meetings of the IMF, of the World Bank, and our investors. That is what implementation entails. We cannot afford to wait for the next COP. Implementation has already begun. Let us not slow the pace down, because all of these successive crises are giving us a message. The injustices we are going through have become unbearable. Crises are aggravating these injustices, and the only way out is by deeply overhauling our mechanisms, our solidarity mechanisms, both private and public. That is what is required, neither less nor more. And this African COP, hosted by Egypt, that I thank once again, will help us do just that. Thank you very much.